My grandfather was the one who taught me what it meant when the birds stopped. I was maybe 10, walking with him along the tree line behind his property in Tioga County, Pennsylvania. He had 40 acres, mostly hardwood, oak, maple, a few stands of hemlock near the creek. I'd been going up there every summer since I could walk. He stopped mid-step one afternoon, held his hand out flat in front of my chest like a crossing guard, and just stood there. I didn't hear anything. That was the point. He waited maybe 40 seconds, then pointed through a gap in the understory at a black bear sow moving through the drainage about 80 yards downhill with 2 cubs behind her. He said, "When everything shuts up at once, something's moving that the woods care about. Could be a bear. Could be a cat. Could be a man. But something made them all decide to be invisible at the same time, and you should listen to that." I carried that with me for 20-some years. I hunt whitetail every November on state game land in the northern tier. I've logged hundreds of hours sitting in stands and walking ridgelines and glassing meadows in the last light of the afternoon. I know what the woods sound like when they're working. Jays calling. Squirrels moving through leaves. The little tapping conversations woodpeckers have between trees. Crows overhead doing their thing. It's not silence, it's a system. Everything out there is talking all the time, and once you've spent enough hours inside it, you stop hearing it as individual sounds and start hearing it the way you hear a room at a party. You just know when the tone changes. November of 2019, I was hunting a stretch of game land in Potter County. It's deep woods up there, second-growth timber, steep ravines, not a lot of road access. I'd parked at a gated fire road around 5 in the morning and walked about 1.5 miles in before first light. I had a climber stand I'd set on a red oak on a ridge that overlooked a saddle between 2 draws. Good spot. Deer move through the saddle regularly in the early morning heading from a bedding area to a crop field about 1/4 mile east. I was up in the stand by 5:45, settled, harness clipped in, rifle across my lap. Dawn came slow. Overcast, low cloud ceiling, temperature around 31 degrees. No wind to speak of, which mattered because still air carries sound better. By about 6:15, the woods were fully lit in that flat gray way overcast mornings have, and the sound system was running. I could hear a nuthatch working a trunk somewhere behind me. Squirrels were already up and rustling in the leaf litter below. A pileated woodpecker started drumming on something hollow about 200 yards south. A normal morning, the kind of morning where you settle into the tree and your breathing slows and you become part of the furniture. Around 6:50, everything stopped. I don't mean it tapered off. I mean it stopped the way a room goes quiet when someone walks in who wasn't expected. 1 second the nuthatch was calling, the squirrels were moving, and I could hear a faint, distant series of crow calls from somewhere east. The next second, nothing. Absolute zero. The kind of silence that has texture to it because your ears are reaching for something and finding nothing to hold on to. I felt my posture change before I consciously registered why. My back straightened. My hand moved to the rifle stock. My eyes started scanning the saddle, then the draws on either side, then the timber behind me as far as I could twist in the stand. I wasn't thinking about deer anymore. My grandfather's rule was specific. When the silence is total and instantaneous, the cause is close. Not a half mile away. Close. Within 100, maybe 200 yards. Because the birds and squirrels nearest to the threat react first, and if the silence reached you that fast, it means the thing that caused it is near your position. I sat still. I controlled my breathing the way you learn to when you're waiting for a shot, but this wasn't that kind of waiting. This was a different kind of still. I was listening with everything I had. About 2 minutes in, and I know it was roughly 2 minutes because I glanced at my watch when it started and checked it again when what happened next happened, I heard movement in the drainage to my left. The west draw. It wasn't footsteps exactly. It was something heavy displacing leaves. Not the quick, light scatter of a deer picking its way through. This was a slower, more deliberate compression. Something with weight moving at a walk. I shouldered the rifle and put the scope on the area. The draw was thick with mountain laurel and hemlock saplings, and the light was poor under the canopy. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it moving. It was heading north through the draw, roughly parallel to the ridge I was on, maybe 60 or 70 yards downhill. Here's what made me uneasy. Deer don't cause that kind of silence. I've watched deer walk directly under my stand while birds continued calling 10 feet away. Squirrels will bark at a deer, sure, but they don't go mute. Turkeys might putt and move off, but they don't vanish. The animals that trigger total environmental silence in Pennsylvania are bears and people. And occasionally a bobcat, but bobcats are so quiet themselves that the woods usually don't react to them until they're very close. This was not a bear. I've heard bears move through brush more times than I can count, and they are not subtle. They crash. They don't care. They roll through laurel thickets like a man walking through a bead curtain. Whatever this was moved with a kind of care that bears don't employ. It was placing its weight deliberately. I followed the sound through the scope, trying to catch movement through gaps in the undergrowth. Once, I thought I saw a branch move, not sway, but deflect, like something had pushed it aside. But I couldn't resolve a shape. The light was flat and the laurel was dense and everything below me was gray-green shadow. It moved through my hearing over maybe 90 seconds, heading north, and then the sound faded. I stayed locked in position for another 5 minutes. Then, slowly, the woods came back. A single crow called. Then another answered. A squirrel started moving somewhere to my east. The nuthatch resumed. Within about 3 minutes, the system was fully restored, as if nothing had happened. I sat in that stand for another 4 hours. I didn't see a single deer. That bothered me more than the silence itself. That saddle was a reliable corridor. I'd hunted it 5 or 6 times that season and the season before. Deer came through it almost every morning. The fact that nothing moved through it that day meant the drainage, the whole area, had been vacated. Whatever passed through had cleared the wildlife out of the zone entirely. Not startled them. Cleared them. That's a meaningful distinction. A startled deer blows and runs 50 yards and stops. A deer that's left the area entirely has made a different calculation. I came down early and walked out. On the fire road, about 3/4 of a mile from where I'd parked, I found a boot print in a muddy section of the road. It was a large print, larger than mine, and I wear an 11, with a heavy lug sole. It was fresh. The edges were crisp. It hadn't rained in 2 days, and this print had been made that morning. There is no legal reason someone couldn't have been walking that fire road. It's state game land. It's open to the public. Hunters use it. Hikers use it occasionally, though not often that deep in November. I'm not claiming the boot print belonged to whatever moved through the drainage. I don't know that. I don't know what was down there. What I know is that the woods went silent in a way I've only experienced a handful of times in decades of being out there. That something heavy moved through the draw with a deliberateness that didn't match any animal I'm familiar with. That the wildlife response was disproportionate, total evacuation, not just alarm. And that someone had walked that road recently enough to leave a print that hadn't begun to dry. I hunted that saddle one more time that season, 5 days later. The morning was normal. Birds were active, squirrels were loud, and a 4-point buck came through the saddle at 7:10. The woods sounded exactly the way they should. And I sat there in the stand and realized that what disturbed me most about the previous visit wasn't the silence or the sound in the drainage or the boot print. It was how completely normal the woods were willing to be afterward. As if whatever had been there was simply a temporary condition the forest had processed and moved past. The woods didn't carry it the way I did. They just went back to work. I still hunt that ridge. I never had another morning like that one. but I think about it every time I climb into the stand, and every time, for the first 10 minutes, I listen harder than I need to. The second account comes from a woman named Dana, who in the summer of 2021 was working as a seasonal field technician for a wildlife monitoring project in the Pisgah National Forest in western North Carolina. Her job involved maintaining trail cameras, collecting SD cards, cataloging species data, and occasionally conducting visual and auditory bird surveys at established points along a transect. She worked in pairs. That was protocol. And her usual partner was a guy named Marcus, a graduate student from Appalachian State, who was working the same contract. Dana had spent 3 summers doing this kind of work in different forests. She was comfortable in the backcountry. She'd encountered bears, rattlesnakes, aggressive grouse, yellow jacket nests in the ground, all the standard things. She wasn't someone who spooked easily, and she had a detailed, almost clinical way of describing what happened, which is part of why this stuck with me when she told it. The transect she and Marcus were working that day was a 4-mile loop through a section of forest on the east side of the Davidson River drainage. Mixed hardwood, rhododendron thickets in the hollows, moderate elevation, nothing unusual about the terrain. They started at the trailhead around 7:30 in the morning. Clear day. Warm for early June, already in the mid-60s by the time they started walking. Humidity was high. The canopy was full, and the understory was thick with summer growth. Visibility on the ground was maybe 30 yards in most places, less in the rhododendron. They hit their first survey point at about 8:15. The protocol for the bird survey was simple. Stand quietly at the marked GPS point for 10 minutes, record every bird species heard or seen within a fixed radius, note the time, weather conditions, and any other wildlife observed. Dana handled the data sheet. Marcus usually handled the camera cards at nearby stations. The first 3 points were unremarkable. Dana logged the usual summer mix: ovenbirds, red-eyed vireos, wood thrushes, hooded warblers, a scarlet tanager at point 2. The forest was loud, in the way that a healthy southern Appalachian forest is loud in June. Layered. Dense with sound. Dana described it as a wall of noise you have to learn to pick apart. She'd gotten good at it. She could separate a vireo's song from a thrush's at 30 yards and assign direction and distance without binoculars. They reached point 4 around 9:40. This was deeper into the transect, on the far side of a low ridge, in a section where the canopy was taller and the understory opened up slightly. There was a seasonal creek nearby, mostly dry, with a gravel bed. Marcus went about 50 yards upslope to swap an SD card on a camera unit that was zip-tied to a tulip poplar. Dana set up at the survey point, started her timer, and began listening. For the first 2 minutes, everything was normal. She logged 2 ovenbirds, a vireo, and a distant pileated woodpecker. Then, at what she recorded on the data sheet as the 2-minute 15-second mark, the sound dropped out. She told me she didn't write anything for the next 7.5 minutes. Just stood there with the clipboard against her chest and listened to nothing. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was, in her words, like someone pulled a plug. One moment the forest was in full voice. The next, the air was empty. She said the silence was so abrupt that her first thought was that something had happened to her hearing, like a sudden pressure change or an ear infection expressing itself. She swallowed hard to pop her ears. Nothing changed. She could hear her own breathing. She could hear her pen click when she pressed it. Her hearing was fine. The forest had simply stopped producing sound. She looked upslope toward where Marcus had gone. She couldn't see him through the foliage, but she didn't hear him either. No rustling, no footsteps, no sound of the camera housing being opened. She almost called out to him but didn't. She told me the silence felt like something she shouldn't break. Like speaking into it would be a mistake, though she couldn't explain why. At roughly the 4-minute mark of the silence, she heard a branch snap. Single, clean, loud. Not a dry twig popping underfoot, a green branch breaking. The sound came from the creek bed, maybe 40 yards south of her position. She turned toward it and saw nothing. The creek bed was partially visible through a gap in the rhododendron, pale gravel, a few scattered rocks, leaf litter along the edges. No movement. She waited. Another minute passed. Then she heard what she described as a scraping drag, something being pulled slowly across gravel. 2, maybe 3 seconds of it. Then silence again. At this point she backed away from the survey point toward the upslope trail and called Marcus's name. Not loudly, at a normal conversational volume. She heard him respond almost immediately. He came down through the brush, camera card in hand, and said, "You hear that?" He'd heard it too. Both of them, 50 yards apart, had experienced the same silence at the same time and heard the same sounds from the creek bed. This is the detail Dana emphasized when she told me this. It wasn't a subjective experience. It wasn't one person's nerves in the deep woods. 2 trained field biologists registered the same environmental shutdown at the same time, independently. They stood together and watched the creek bed for several minutes. Nothing emerged. Nothing moved that they could see. The forest did not immediately recover. Dana said it took what felt like a long time. She estimated 6 or 7 minutes after she and Marcus reunited, before the first bird called again. It was a wood thrush, from somewhere east. Then another bird, then another. The sound rebuilt itself in layers, like an orchestra tuning up after an interruption. They completed the survey point. Dana logged the silence as a data gap and noted the anomaly, and continued to point 5. The rest of the transect was normal. Full sound, full activity, no further interruptions. They finished the loop by early afternoon and drove back to the field station. That evening, Dana pulled the SD card Marcus had collected from the camera at point 4. Trail cameras in wildlife surveys are triggered by motion and heat. They photograph whatever trips the sensor, usually deer, raccoons, coyotes, sometimes hikers. She scrolled through the images. Most were the standard catalog: 2 deer at night, a raccoon, a turkey. Then she hit a sequence of 3 images timestamped that morning between 9:38 and 9:42. The camera was positioned facing downslope, toward the drainage, with the creek bed partially in frame. The first image showed nothing, just the empty forest, the gravel, the rhododendron. The second image, taken 90 seconds later, showed something in the creek bed. Dana described it as a shape low to the ground, partially obscured by a rock outcrop, that was difficult to resolve because of the dappled light and the camera's resolution. It wasn't a bear. The proportions were wrong. It appeared to be a person, on their hands and knees or in a low crouch, positioned in the gravel. The coloring was muted, dark clothing or very dirty skin, she couldn't be sure. The third image, taken about a minute later, showed the creek bed empty again. Dana showed the images to Marcus that evening. He agreed the second image appeared to show a human figure. They reported the anomaly to their project lead, who noted it and advised them to carry radios and bear spray on subsequent transects in that section, which they were already doing. No one followed up further. There was no formal incident because nothing had technically happened. No one had been approached. No one had been threatened. A person in a national forest is not an event. Dana told me the thing that stayed with her was not the image. It was the silence. She'd done hundreds of bird surveys in multiple forests across 3 states. She'd never recorded a total auditory shutdown like that. Not during bear encounters, not during storm fronts moving in, not during overhead raptor passes, all of which can partially suppress songbird activity. What she experienced that morning was categorical. Everything stopped at once, across a wide area, for an extended duration, and the only thing they found was a single human shape, low in a creek bed, moving slowly enough and quietly enough that neither of them saw it with their eyes. She told me that what she couldn't stop thinking about was the drag sound on the gravel. Because whatever was moving in that creek bed, it wasn't walking. It was pulling itself. And she couldn't think of a normal reason for that. The third account is different from the others in that the narrator, a man named Colton, did not experience the event alone, and the aftermath was not ambiguous. Something happened. Something was found. And it still sits wrong with him, not because of what it turned out to be, but because of the way the forest telegraphed it. Colton and his wife Jess own 11 acres outside of Ellijay, Georgia, in Gilmer County. It's mountain property, steep in places, wooded with white pine and hickory, with a seasonal branch that runs through the lower third of the lot. They built a cabin on it in 2017 and use it most weekends from April through November. It's not remote in the true backcountry sense. There's a paved county road within a quarter mile, and a neighbor's property adjoins theirs to the south, but when you're on the back half of the land, in the trees, you can't see or hear any sign of human development. It feels like deep woods even though it technically isn't. Colton grew up in North Georgia. He hunts, fishes, and has spent more of his life in wooded terrain than out of it. Jess is from Atlanta originally but has been with Colton for 12 years and has become fluent in the environment. They know their property the way you know a room you walk through every day. They know where the deer bed. They know which trees the barred owls use. They know where the copperheads like to sun in the spring and which rocks the creek exposes when the water drops in late summer. On a Saturday in mid-October 2022, they were on the property together. The weather was ideal, clear, mid-50s, light breeze from the northwest. The leaves were turning but hadn't dropped yet, so the canopy was still partially intact and the light that came through was filtered in gold. They'd spent the morning at the cabin doing maintenance work, and around 1 in the afternoon, they decided to walk the property line on the east side. They'd noticed a section of old fence wire back there that was sagging and wanted to assess whether it needed repair before winter. They walked the trail Colton had cut through the woods. It wasn't much of a trail, just a cleared footpath, and reached the east boundary at about 1:20. The fence was old agricultural wire, rusted, strung between locust posts that had been there since before they bought the land. They followed it south, checking posts, and Jess was photographing the damaged sections on her phone so they could plan materials. At roughly 1:35, and Colton is specific about this because he'd checked the time on his phone just before it happened, they were standing near a bend in the fence line where it turned downhill toward the creek. The woods around them were in full afternoon mode. Colton described it as loud for October, crickets still going, a few late-season katydids, blue jays calling, a Carolina wren going off somewhere nearby. The creek was audible downhill, a light trickle. Wind in the leaves overhead. A full, comfortable, familiar sound profile. Then it stopped. Colton told me he felt it in his chest before he processed it intellectually. Like a hum he hadn't known was there had been switched off. Jess looked at him at the same moment. She'd felt it too. They didn't speak. They stood still, both of them oriented slightly downhill toward the creek, because that's the direction the silence seemed to have weight. As if the absence of sound had a source, and the source was below them. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. Not a cricket. Not a bird. Not the wind. The air felt, in Colton's word, pressurized. Like the space between the trees had tightened. Jess whispered, "Something's down there." Colton nodded. He wasn't armed, they hadn't been planning to go far from the cabin, and he doesn't carry a rifle on maintenance walks. He had a folding knife in his pocket and a fencing tool in his hand. That was it. They stood on the slope above the creek for close to 2 minutes, watching the tree line below. The creek bed wasn't fully visible from their position, the terrain dropped off and the rhododendron was thick near the water. They could see the tops of the laurel and the lower trunks of the pines along the bank, but not the ground. Then both of them heard a sound. Colton called it a groan. Not an animal vocalization he recognized. Not a branch settling. A low, sustained, breathy sound that lasted maybe 2 seconds and came from the creek drainage, 40 or 50 yards below them. It didn't repeat. Jess grabbed his arm. "That's a person," she said. They looked at each other and had the kind of silent conversation that 12 years together allows. Colton started downhill. Jess followed. They went slowly, staying on the slope above the drainage, trying to get a line of sight through the undergrowth. Colton called out once, "Hey, anyone down there?" No response. They worked their way down over several minutes, sidestepping on the steep ground, Colton leading, until they reached a point where the slope leveled out and the creek bed became visible through a break in the laurel. There was a man in the creek bed. He was lying on his side on the rocks, legs bent, one arm folded under his body and the other extended outward over the gravel. He was wearing jeans and a dark flannel shirt. No shoes. His feet were bare and visibly dirty, scratched, the soles dark. He was not moving. Colton shouted to him. No response. He and Jess approached carefully. The man was alive. They could see his torso moving with shallow breaths, but he was unresponsive to voice. His eyes were open, or partially open, and unfocused. His lips were cracked and dry. There was no visible injury, no blood, no obvious trauma. He appeared to be a white male, middle-aged, thin to the point of gauntness, with several days of beard growth. He smelled strongly of urine and something else Colton described as sour, like old sweat and acetone. Colton called 911 from his cell phone. He had partial signal, enough to connect. He gave the location as best he could, describing the property and the access road. Jess stayed with the man, who didn't react to her presence. She tried speaking to him, tried asking his name, tried asking if he could hear her. His eyes moved once, tracking something above the canopy that neither of them could see, and then went still again. The paramedics reached them about 40 minutes later, coming in on the county road and then on foot through Colton's property with a litter. By the time they arrived, the man had not spoken, had not moved from his position, and had not responded to anything. The medic started in 4, checked his vitals, and transported him out. A sheriff's deputy came by the cabin about 2 hours later to take a statement. Colton and Jess told him what happened. The deputy said they'd had a report of a missing person from a care facility in Dawsonville, about 20 miles south, 3 days earlier. The description was consistent. He said the man had a history of severe psychiatric illness and had walked away from the facility. How he'd covered 20 miles of mountain terrain barefoot over 3 days in his condition was something the deputy didn't speculate on, and Colton didn't ask. The man survived. Colton followed up with the sheriff's office a week later and was told the individual had been returned to care and was being treated for dehydration and exposure. No charges. No further investigation. The case, such as it was closed. But here's what Colton told me he thinks about, and why he called it a story about the woods going quiet and not a story about finding a sick man in a creek bed. He said the silence that afternoon was not proportional to what they found. He's found injured deer on his property. He's come across a dead coyote near the creek. Once, a black bear sow with cubs bedded down within 100 yards of the cabin. None of those caused what he experienced that day. The wildlife on his property responds to those things with specific, localized reactions, alarm calls, avoidance patterns, directional movement. What happened that afternoon was different. It was, in his words, total. Every sound source across what felt like several acres simply stopped at the same moment. As if the entire local ecosystem recognized something that he and Jess couldn't identify until they walked downhill and found it. He said he's thought about this a lot. The man in the creek bed wasn't a predator. He wasn't a threat. He was barely conscious. He was a sick, barefoot, emaciated person lying on rocks in a state of medical crisis. And the woods reacted to his presence the way they react to an apex predator, with complete, instantaneous silence. Colton doesn't have an explanation for that. Neither do I. But he told me something his father once said to him, years ago, that he didn't understand at the time and thinks about differently now. His father said, "The woods don't read intent. They read wrongness. They don't care whether something is dangerous. They care whether something doesn't belong." He said that man didn't belong in those woods. Not because he was trespassing. Not because he was a threat. But because he was dying, barefoot, on rocks, 20 miles from where anyone knew he was, with his eyes open and no one behind them. And the woods knew it before Colton and Jess did. The whole forest went quiet to say, "Something here is wrong." And they listened, and they walked downhill, and they found the wrongness, and it was just a man who needed help. Colton told me the woods were back to normal within 30 minutes of the paramedics carrying the man out. The jays came back first. Then the wrens. Then the crickets. By the time the deputy left the cabin that evening, the barred owls were calling from the pines along the creek as if nothing had happened. The system had registered the anomaly, communicated it, and then, once the anomaly was removed, simply resumed. He and Jess still walked that property every weekend. The fence got repaired. The creek still runs through the lower third. And occasionally, on a still afternoon, when they're out near the tree line and the woods are loud with all the things that live in them, one of them will stop, and the other will notice, and they'll both stand there and listen. Not because they're afraid. Because they learned something that day about the place they live inside of. The forest is a system, and it is always listening, and sometimes it tells you things you need to hear if you're willing to stand still long enough to notice that the noise has stopped.